Okay, well, I guess I'll start. I think it's an extreme honor for us, SOCAR, to be invited to today's KL Startup Summit. I think the pertinent questions that we have to ask ourselves in today's world where there's just so much uncertainty and inequality facing different communities. And I think when we were invited to talk about mobility today, by the Startup Summit organizers, I think there are a few key questions that I actually wanted all of us on today's session to start asking ourselves. And the first most important question that I think we, as participants in the startup community, as well as participants in our community should ask is, how did we get here in the first place? I think the question of how did you get here is actually super important. I think during most years, this KL Summit will be probably held at a conference where there's a physical element of mobility to it, right? We will have to figure out how we get from point A to this venue summit. But today's call is probably one of the first few sessions where we're actually doing it on a virtual call. So I think even as we're moving towards a connected world where everything can be done remotely, I think the question of how did we get here becomes super important. And you know what? I think that's a question that a lot of us take for granted. How do you get to work in the mornings? How do you get your kids to school? How do you get people to access the right amount of healthcare? How do you get to, the right places to get food choices? How do you get access to supermarkets? I think the concept of mobility is actually super important, not just in terms of our day-to-day lives, but also in terms of getting to places of the right economic outcome. So I think mobility is key in driving two key things. First of all, it drives communities to connect back with one another. I think the face-to-face element of meeting up, connecting with different human beings is something that's almost too understated. The importance of it is something that we cannot be ignored. But I think the second more important part is, how does mobility drive better economic outcomes? And as I mentioned, I think the answer that, to that question of how do we get here is something that we often take for granted, right? How do we get to work? How do you get home? But, I remember almost probably back in 2012, before, there was actually such a concept called ride sharing or e-hailing. Normally when we go out late at night, sometimes the concept of how do we get home after a night, if you chose not to drive, right? If you decided not to have a car, the decision behind that was actually quite challenging, right? Taxis were expensive, they're not really available, and the concept of how do we get back was actually a very, very challenging question. However, over time, we've seen that technology has actually evened the playing field, not just for consumers who now have more ready access to transportation, more so than ever before. Now that transportation has become more reliable, right, with the MRT, with the LRT, with ride sharing, with car sharing, consumers have more options than ever. But on the flip side of the equation, service providers also have more options than ever. And these are options not just to provide a service, not just to extend mobility coverage to underserved areas, but also access to different economic opportunities. And so I think one question that I want all of us to walk away from today's summit, especially during the mobility section, is asking the question, which is, how do we get here? And where do we go from here? And I think to answer that first question, where a lot of us take mobility for granted, I think one thing I wanted to point out is that different cities have different levels of mobility coverage, right? It remains a fact today that, in KL, public transportation adoption still remains around the 20% mark, right? Nowhere near our neighbors, which stands above 60, or even in Hong Kong, which is close to about 80%. And another interesting statistic to note is that in Malaysia, the average number of steps walked daily is actually only 3,900 steps. In Hong Kong, that number is almost double at 6,900. Why is that the case? And I think that leads back to a thesis which I think is central to what we'll be discussing today. And it's very relevant to today's summit, which is the KL Startup Summit. And that thesis is the fact that not all cities are built equal. We have the likes of New York, we have the likes of Singapore or Hong Kong, where the core CBD area, the central business district areas, has a high amount of density, right? Density measured by, number of buildings per square kilometer, number of public transportation service coverage points per square kilometer, as well as population density. Right? On top of that, cities like New York are also based off a grid light system where there are many interchangeable routes. Right? If you miss one turning, you can easily go to the next avenue or next street, take a left turn, take a right turn, and go back to your original destination. And so what I'm trying to say here is that when we finally admit and acknowledge that not all cities are built equally, we need to come up with truly localized solutions to solve this problem. So in a place like Klang Valley or Kuala Lumpur, where we're pretty much a city or urban development, many separate townships connected by expressways, right? NKVE, NPE, Duke, KLSS, MEX. These are terms that we're super familiar with. We're also very comfortable with paying tolls to access these expressways. However, when you have a city that's fairly sprawled out, that actually consists of many different townships, to access one township from the other, Subang Jaya to PJ, to even say Bangsa or KL Central area, that requires travel across some of these expressways that I talked about. And today, one of the easiest ways to travel on these expressways and the most convenient is actually through using a four-wheel vehicle. So cars are very popular in Malaysia, right? Not just because Malaysians don't like walking, not because our average steps rank among one of the lowest in the region or in the world, but it's because of the way the city is built. Right? There's no easy way, even if I live 2 kilometers away, to walk from, say, Damansara Heights across to PJ. Right? Even though I do know people who jog from TTDI to Bangsa, that's not a common occurrence. And so when we realize that cities are not built equally, we need to take the next step to then ask the question, how do we use mobility tech as an equalizer? And actually, I'd like to draw us to another interesting statistic, which is from the GPS provider, TomTom. So one thing we realized was that in the year 2019, right, on average, every single driver in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, loses an average of 7 days and 2 hours in traffic. In 2020, when there was the pandemic, when people started working from home, that actually significantly reduced from 7 days to 5 days and 6 hours. So what we see here is structural shifts in behavior, innovative ways around better ways of allocating workspaces, more creative ways of working remotely can have a direct, immediate impact on mobility and the amount of time wasted. Imagine that was a future where on average, people don't lose more than 24 hours a year in traffic. What could you do with 6 more days of your life? Right? Even at work, we constantly hear people complaining, hey, I don't get enough paid leave, my vacation days are too short, I want extra leave, I want more public holidays. But think about the time that you actually spent lost, stuck in traffic, stuck in badly congested situations, behind 2 wheels where you can't do anything else. And so I think the solution to mobility and to solving some of these productivity and congestion issues is really about sharing. Not just more sharing, just more walking, but also more sharing of creative ideas. So in today's platform, I really want the people dialing in, the panelists, to really share their ideas, to really push the boundaries, to be creative, to tell us what are these ideas that can drive better mobility outcomes, which in turn will lead to better economic outcomes. Right? At SOCAR, we are committed to actually empowering people to go carless. We want to give people at least a choice to say, look, if you don't want to take on a car loan, if you don't want to buy a second car, if you don't want to even have a car at all, you still can get around without compromising any convenience and any flexibility. And that's why when we first launched, we came up with the concept of multi-mobility. But over time, we've evolved to become so much more than that. Right? At SOCAR now, we have multiple brands. We have SOCAR, we have SOCAR to You, where we deliver a car right to your doorstep and you can pick it up and drop off your car anywhere else. We have a bus driver concept where, if you decide to go out and have a good time, and maybe you have a few beverages, or you're tired, or you're under medication, and you decide not to drive home, we have a buddy driver that's fully insured. They can come to wherever you are to drive you in your own car back to your house safely. We also have SOCAR Plus, a chauffeur-driven service. And on the other hand, we also have travel. Travel is such a powerful concept in the city and in the country where car ownership on a percentage of a household basis stands at above 90%. Travel is our people-to-people, peer-to-peer platform that allows people with assets they already own, that they're already paying off loans for, to share their cars in exchange for additional income, right? And on top of that, with travel, we realize that a key part of building trust within the peer-to-peer car sharing ecosystem is actually to have the right insurance coverage and the right insurance protection. So we've even gone the extra step to ensure that every single host can have the right protection that they want for their cars. So at SOCAR, we like to believe that we're much more than a car. We're offering people choices when it comes to mobility, right? And when it comes to choices, I always like to tell people, no one ever chooses to go bankrupt. No one ever chooses to not be able to pay car loans. No one chooses to be able to sacrifice buying something or paying for healthcare in exchange for paying off a car. But unfortunately, 1 in 4 bankruptcy cases in Malaysia are due to car loan defaults. So we, as a startup community, we as innovative companies can play our role in really changing these outcomes. And more importantly, I think the business leaders and the decision makers in the enterprises and the startups in KL can do what they need to truly empower the employees and organizations to have more choice, whether it's where to work, what time to work, how they work, or even what they work on, right? Ultimately, I believe a happy, creative employee will be a lot more productive than an employee that feels restrained and not allowed to explore other areas which should develop their intellectual curiosity. So ultimately, better mobility outcomes in this case will lead to higher productivity. And I think we, as participants in the startup economy in Malaysia and in KL, should all strive for higher productivity. Because ultimately, this will be better for our businesses, it'll be better for our bottom line, and we can grow faster and really build KL into the ecosystem that we truly want it to be. So in today's session, we'll explore what mobility as an equalizer means. I talked about a few things, right? By just reducing time stuck in traffic, people can now have more hours to explore new areas, develop new skill sets, right? By having access to the right schools, you can actually change the productivity outcome of a child. So what I'm saying here is today, we're going to explore mobility as an equalizer. That'll be a constant theme. But more importantly, with the future of mobility moving towards autonomous driverless cars, as well as electric vehicles, what does this mean when it comes to sustainability? And why is sustainability so important when it comes to creating more equitable economic outcomes? So we could talk about carbon credits, for example. We could talk about EV taxation. But these are all issues that ultimately not just drive mobility, but drive better economic outcomes. And I mentioned, eventually I see mobility as one of the biggest equalizers. And that's the reason why you have the likes of Gojek, you have the likes of Grab, and hopefully SOCAR in the future, where we aim to be the kind of unicorns and decacorns of the next 5 years, so that we can actually play our role in creating these better economic outcomes. So look, thank you so much for having us kick off this summit. I'm very excited to hear more about what the other speakers have to say. I think the next speaker, doesn't need much introduction, but he's a good friend and partner that works in the Malaysian industry agency called Mari. And I think they're going to play a huge role in driving better mobility outcomes for Malaysia in a more equitable manner. So I'm very much looking forward to his next keynote speech, and thank you for having me. Thank you.